So while we get some microphones distributed for questions from the floor, let me just start with my political question, which is that when we talk to politicians about changing the curriculum, the first question we often get is, will it improve the standardized test scores? And the answer is no, and you see them glaze over. How do we deal with the measurement and needs of the stakeholders not matching actually the needs of what's good for education? Anyone to respond to that? Please.
I should probably have the...
And if somebody wants to raise a question for the next question. Mike?
Screen? Is that... Oh, it is working. Sorry. As I said in my presentation, it's not only the politicians. Politicians react, well, largely, to public pressure. So if you want to make a change in the maths curriculum, you have to get public pressure behind you. You have to get families who are sending their kids to schools to want that change. So you're going to have to sell it to them first. You're going to have to get the teachers on board, the teacher unions on board, and also the sort of the extraneous actors like the assessment agencies, both the teacher registration agency and standards, qualifications agencies, and all the rest. So it's never good enough just to go to the government with a good idea. Most governments around the world believe that they make what is known as evidence-based policy making, which means that they think that they are making their decisions on what policies to push based on the best available evidence. In practice, most people here will have worked with governments in one form or another, and you will know that that's not always the case. But you have to make a case with evidence. So you have to be able to show what you gain. And in the simplest terms, it often comes down to a cost-benefit analysis.
Thanks. How
much will it cost? What will we get out of it?
Jay, you had a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think CK12 provides open math and science curriculum for middle school and high school. And I think the biggest issue we've had, again, is can you trust? And there's a lot of open content providers out there that that are doing really interesting things. But then the question is, can you trust it with what currently exists? And with the curriculum that's provided by the states that go down to the districts and go down to the schools, they're purpose-built for these standardized tests that are provided by the same publishers. And so when there's a risk equation that a teacher has to make. Do I switch off of what's been provided to me and go to something new? And if I do, then I'm on my own. So these are the kinds of questions that are in the minds of the educators that are educating our kids. And so again, it comes down to evidence and it comes down to awareness. You know, at CK12, we take a different approach. We go through the same process a publisher does in producing the content. So we don't just aggregate content and make it available. We produce it with the same quality standards because we know that the trust and the efficacy is a big, issue. And we did a pilot in Utah with the Utah Open Textbook Initiative, and it's been a 3-year initiative where it's been across. The pilot was with 4,000 students, and what they found was with textbooks that were provided that were OER textbooks, they had the same student outcomes as with high-cost textbooks. And so we're seeing that as more evidence comes to light, that trust factor will start to build.
Thanks. Let's take from the front row.
Yes, this is for you. In your pre and post test, what was on the test? I mean, do you have an example of it, or in what language was it in?
The pre-post test was in Arabic, of course, because the children speak Arabic. And it was designed on the basis of the material offered during the 6 weeks, which started with the absolute beginning of mathematics numeracy, so amount, numbers, sound. And it will go up to adding up to 10. So very simple, very basic. We made sure there were enough items in the test to discriminate between children who would do better and children who would do worse. We'd give them 2 chances at the same item. So we had a protocol for the observer to read the question. And then if the child didn't understand, he would read the question again. Answered correctly the first time, we'll give 2 points. Answered correctly the second time, we'll give 1 point. If not answered correctly, move on to the next item. After 5 items not answered correctly, stop doing the test because it was getting more difficult. And we also made sure that the National Council for Mathematics approved this test before it was administered.
Thank you. Over at the back there?
Yeah. What I've seen CK12 doing is not just having open curriculum, but starting to push towards the boundary of open sourced curriculum that's hackable and remixable by teachers. And I really want to hear you speak to that and where we can go in that. So, in some of the things that we've seen presented today, they still seem closed, but I want them to be radically opened where I can see the source and play around with it and turn it into my own materials and make it appropriate for my own students. And maybe that's part of the grassroots change that we could see is empowering teachers with that curriculum.
Anyone like to respond?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. So you're absolutely right. All of the material, so CK12, we published about 180 textbooks in science and math. We've also broken down that curriculum into 5,000 core concepts. And each of those core concepts have at least 15 different learning resources with multiple modalities, from reading to videos to simulations to real-world examples. And all of it is under a Creative Commons non-commercial license that's completely modifiable and remixable by the teacher. And I think where we're seeing a lot of real interest is teachers want to have that flexibility. They want to align it to their lesson plans. They want to include their own examples that contextualize it for the kids. And this is the model that is the natural model that fits people's behavior, and we're trying to enable that. And that's the purpose of what we're doing at CK12.
Anyone else want to respond to that? Okay, let's take the question here then.
Yeah, you talk about the politics of making change, and there I see at least 3 major constituencies that can influence that. There's the parents, there's the teachers, and there's the educational industrial complex, where all the money is. And so in trying to make change, you want to get these 3 constituencies to get together on it. And what I've seen in my experience is that what usually is happening is there's a high level of divisiveness that leads to the inability to actually implement change, which goes back to the new math movement in the history of the United States education. And so I don't know how to address that, but I think it's an important thing that needs to be addressed is how do we deal with keeping the divisiveness down in making change?
Anyone care to take that? Mark.
Only to agree with you completely. It's a real struggle. In most developing countries, it's almost impossible to get the teacher unions, people from the government, and any outside organization, representatives from the business community, to sit down at the same table. It's really tough work.
Do you want to comment?
Yes, I'd like to add that, especially in developing countries, you sometimes have the possibility to do leapfrogging. If the situation is really bad, people will step up and allow for you to experiment, and as long as you stay within their own formal limits, which will give you a chance to show if this can work or not. And the moment you can show, it has a better possibility of reaching further.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment too. I think desperation is the best form of progress. If people are spending their time squabbling, which is a natural state, the problem has to be great for people to rally together. And I think also in speaking to meaningful change, there's sort of 3 components to it from our observation. One is if there's a problem, you have to have good supply, right? So the good supply of the materials and the tools and the models that make up this new world we're envisioning. You also have to have demand that's receptive, right? So if there's too much risk for teachers or parents to use something new, they won't change. But if they're aware of it and they see it and there's evidence that it works, then it'll start to change. And then the last thing, I think the last piece is mature policy. But I think mature policy comes in toward the end after there's really supply and demand that have emerged grassroots. The policies will change when the mainstream has adopted this in a meaningful way.
Thank you.
Right?
At the back there.
So this question is for Jay. The New York Times initially started giving the newspaper away for free online, and so did the Washington Post, and then Huffington Post came along, and as a result, the Times and Washington Post are really struggling to fund good journalism. And so we kind of have this climate of content as a commodity. Are you concerned at all that this race towards free potentially makes it more difficult for better things to come along? I know that you guys, like your stuff side by side looks basically equivalent to a textbook, and so it's great that you guys are kind of eating their lunch, but are you worried that it may be sucking all the oxygen out of the room for other people to do something different?
So that's a really good question. And I think in funding high quality materials, there needs to be a sustainable model, right? So, with CK12, we have, we're funded by, a great family foundation, Vinod and Niru Khosla. But that's not a sustainable model for, funding great content. It just can't be rich people, spending money on content. So the sustainable model, I think, it actually, this is a sort of a catalyst for change, but the sustainable model that I see is not around, it's not around actually continuously funding content. Actually, the content in education comes from the teachers and the teaching community, right? Because if they have a good seed, and especially with educational content, foundational educational content doesn't change a whole lot. The examples might change, but the core fundamental principles, you're still learning quadratic equations, you're still learning harmonic motion, you're still learning two variable, you're still learning matrix multiplication, right? So those things are not changing. So if you have a good basis for that, the teachers are the ones that make it alive, make that alive. And so we think that content in education is different from news content and that sort of thing. If you have that good fundamental content, then the services and the models that will make money will emerge that are outside of content.
Thank you. In the middle here, in the stripes.
Hi, my question is for Jay, and perhaps it's too personal of a question, but I was reading on your bio that it said that you were doing somewhat similar position at McGraw-Hill, working with online or digital content. My question is, why did you leave the position at McGraw-Hill to found your own similar position? Was it because you found that you could affect more change outside of the existing structure? If so, how do you suggest that we affect similar change within the existing structure? That's a lot of questions, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's that's a deep question. So, McGraw-Hill is a fantastic organization, but I think the issue with the McGraw-Hill in really leading the transformation is that they have a business model to protect, right? They have a fixed cost structure and a business model that the new business models may not be able to support. And so I ran digital for the higher ed business, and so I ran a very fast-growing business for the college business of McGraw-Hill. And what I saw is the writing on the wall was there. Everything was going to transform to be more digitally and technology-based and technology-oriented. And I think for folks inside the system, I think helping teachers and helping instructors and helping students embrace these new models in really meaningful ways, not to just buy a device and use it in the classroom, but actually incorporate into the teaching is, I think, the way to really drive the change.
Thanks. Conrad.
I had a chicken and egg question, and this refers to a rather earlier discussion. So much of what's being described is how you evolve things, which is probably what one needs to do. But the problem I'm trying to understand is, given that we think there's a fundamental change to the subject of maths, not just its delivery, but the subject. That's why there was the joke about the quadratic equations, because we were discussing those yesterday, Jay, as not being things you should necessarily do. How does the chicken and egg work between getting people on the ground to make and like the change? And many people do like the idea of the change, but then they say, well, we've got to do the assessments, and the assessments are set by government, and the government insists that you have to do your quadratic equations or whatever it is. So how does that chicken and egg thing do when you're trying to reform the fundamental subject rather than delivery? And the second question also is, how do we politically get the users of math, rather than mathematicians per se, to be setting the curricula? Because it's the users of math, which we reckon are 95% not mathematicians, that should be setting it, because they're the people who represent what you're using it for and what people need to use it for. And how do we change that process, which I think will help with the other side of that question?
Who'd like to respond to that? Hester?
Yeah. I'll go into your second question first, because what we did was not change the maths curriculum, so I'm not the one to answer that one. If we try and look at the way we deliver the maths curriculum, we are always involving real-life situations. I'm from the Netherlands, and education in the Netherlands is really based on this as well. We call it realistic mathematics. And we always start from the real-life situation, have the children try and find out how things work, and then try and move to a more abstract level and go to the sums. And this is actually what we brought into the Sudan project as well, and we actually sneaked it in a little bit, because we said we will follow your curriculum, but in the end we were trying to do this realistic thing at the same time. So you can see pictures of children buying vegetables at a shop, because that is what they will do, and later on it will be things that will relate to their normal life. So it's more about the delivery of the maths and making sure that realistic examples exist in there. And I think it's really important, because the abstract things are just a trick. And it's not about learning tricks, but it's about understanding how you can use them in real life.
Does anyone want to respond to the first part?
I'll try. Actually, I think the trick to this chicken and egg question has been in the previous two answers. You've got to start small. Start small, start sort of under the radar, build up the evidence, build up the commitment of families, and then when you've got a complete package that you know works, that you know is going to be convincing, that's when you go to the politicians, the teacher unions, everybody else. But you've got to, with these sort of things, you can't take a top-down approach, you have to take a bottom-up approach.
Thanks. Helen? Oh, sorry. So can I come back to you with the microphone in a moment? So let me take this one first, and I'll come to you next.
Yeah, just a comment, and back mainly to Conrad's thought, and just to set some context. So it's a comment, if I can ask for your reflection on it. So for the last 20 years, my colleague Susan and I at the Anytime Anywhere Learning Foundation have been evangelising around the world on the work of Professor Seymour Papert, that every child should have their own personal portable computer. The point isn't about the technology, and it isn't about them having the computer. It's about what it makes possible, to allow them to do things they couldn't do before at a level of complexity that was not previously available to them. And the point about it is, what's the vision? The vision is about what that makes possible, and what that makes possible is higher achievement. Now, the point of what computer-based maths is about is not about putting maths on a computer. And I understand that we've got to be, focused on some of the issues around it, but the real point is about higher achievement. It's about what it allows kids to do. It allows them to do mathematics that they could not do before. It allows more kids to understand more often more complex ideas about mathematics at a deeper level than was not possible to them before. And the point about the argument about bringing change is that's the message we've got to get across to the broad constituency of parents, stakeholders, politicians, and I'd have to say the one group that hasn't been mentioned much, policy leadership. Policy leadership is minister -1, -2. So you go to a minister, sure, they're going to be influenced by the families. And I agree with you about the influence on families, and we're doing work in that space. We're trying to set out a sort of a viral support for parents because they're poorly informed about this idea. But it's the policy leaders just under the politicians who have to be convinced, and I agree with your comment, that you have to build the evidence of the engagement that's possible now through these ideas at that deeper level and the higher achievement that comes as a result of that, that will allow you to build that sustainable change.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a very, I completely agree, and I think what technology provides, I mean, if you look at Wolfram, if you look at many great technology that are out there, it allows a student to build an intuition around mathematics, right? And these things were not possible with paper and pencil. And I think we're also in an interesting age where things go viral. And things, whether it's Arab Spring or Instagram or Snapchat, things can go viral, and that grassroots viral nature of a connected society can go then up to make policy change. And I think we've got to find that secret, catalyst in education. And we are starting to see evidence of it, like, things with the massive online courses. And, we're seeing these things starting to happen, and that's what we've got to really catalyze. Find those things that really build grassroots support with families, with teachers, with parents. And the technology is there, and the connectedness is there to make that happen.
Thank you. Helen.
Hello. I hope you remember that I work for Cambridge International Examinations, and my question is to bring the panel back to that word sustainable in the title. So we're often invited into countries which have already spent millions of pounds, may have been spent in that country by the large donor organisations like the World Bank, like UNICEF. And when we start working in that country, we actually find very little impact from that large amount of money that's been spent on education. So my question for the panel is, well, I have two really. The first one is, have we just been unlucky in the countries that we've been into? How does one make that kind of change sustainable? And I'm thinking in the context of computer-based maths. So if a very new sort of cutting-edge curriculum is brought in, there will always be adopters who enjoy that kind of cutting-edge experience early on, and they're innovators. But how do you sustain that change? So, thank you.
Want to respond?
Yes, I'd like to. Thank you.
And in fact,
for
if
this
you all
question.
want to say something, and then we'll wrap up after this one. Oh, time for one more? Okay. In the middle here. Okay. Please, go ahead, Hester.
Okay. Before I went into the Sudan project, I raised a little bit about the failures that have been done before, because I think for about 20 years, developing countries have been trying to change their educational systems. And I think up to date, it hasn't really succeeded. And actually, it goes back to my slide on the combination of the bottom-up and the top-down approach. What I found was that some of the projects used a top-down approach, and they'd go with the education for teachers, and they'd go with the government and have legislation about this. But then it wouldn't touch on really teaching teachers how to teach in a different way. It would be regulations, it would be top-down, and the teachers were not able to deliver this new way of teaching. On the other hand, where they were able to do this, you'd have one or two teachers coming to a new school with a new way of teaching, and then within a year, they would adjust to the sitting way of teaching, which was there already. So it's very hard for new teachers to introduce a new way of teaching in a school which is much larger and already doing their own thing. Then, on the other hand, there have been the bottom-up approaches, which have been very successful at a very small scale, And they work for as long as there is an enormous effort from outside. The moment people pull out, it will die away, and it's not sustainable. So when teachers move to the cities, it will not stay the same. So actually, I think it has been mentioned yesterday, start with the small changes, but also at the very beginning involve the other levels of education.
Thank you. Let's just take one last question right at the back there.
Well, so it's actually follows on quite nicely. So I think if you've worked a lot in Kenya, which it seems you have, the Samasi initiative was one of these things which did try to change the way teachers teach, and which did all that. And one of the things which I think technology really helps is that what happened with the Samase project was it was very much Chinese whispers. It went through so many layers to reach all the teachers that by the time the message was lost. Whereas the technology doesn't get diluted as easily. And so there is this combination, as you say, of going from the bottom up and the top down, and the technology, what really happens with your open textbooks and so on, is that the message is preserved. You actually, and this opportunity wasn't there a few years ago. And so I think, you know, and the question I have has sort of gone away now, but it's sort of really in response to this, I think there is an opportunity now that wasn't there before, because technology can now help to sort of keep the message intact.
Any quick responses to that?
I think it refers to the project that TNO together with Watch Out Holland is doing in South Sudan at this moment, teacher training with use of offline databases with examples of good teaching. So absolutely right.
I have a question for Jay.
Actually, I think we have to wrap up at this point because we're now already over the end of our time for the session. So perhaps you could ask that after the session. So let me thank all of our panelists for their exciting contributions.